tell me about yourself. The most common job interview question everybody's wondering about. I don't understand why this is such a popular question, but it is. It's probably popular because it's just so stupid. I'm not a fan of this question. This is the most lazy, cliched question that a interviewer, whether they're a hiring manager or a recruiter, could ask you. But you are almost guaranteed to get asked this question in some form. Usually it's the first real question that they ask when they've started the interview. So you're going to get this right at the beginning, okay? It could come in slightly different forms. They could say, please introduce yourself. They could say, what brings you here? Something like that. But they're all versions of tell me about yourself. So this question serves as an icebreaker. Okay, what that means is it's something that just gets the conversation started. And that's why they ask this in the beginning. Also, just so you know, from the perspective of the recruiter on the other side of the table, the other reason they ask this question is because if they're doing multiple job interviews that day back to back, and they haven't had any time, or maybe they're just lazy, they haven't had any time to do any homework and brush up on who the next candidate is before the candidate comes into the room and they have to start interviewing. The great thing from their perspective about this question is that you don't need to know anything about the person you're talking to. You can still ask them this question. And it's kind of a help to you if you haven't done your homework and you haven't brushed up on who the next candidate is, because they're going to tell you who they are, right? They're going to give you the basics on them, usually. So that's why they like this question so much. Very lazy question. But it's the icebreaker. It's the first thing they're going to say. And the reason why that makes this question so important is that usually it's by answering this question that you're making your first impression, right? You want to make a good first impression. And so if this is the first thing they ask you, you're going to make your first impression by answering this. So that's why it's kind of important to know what to do and to know what they're asking. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. Another thing about making a first impression is, if you don't know this already, sometimes it can be a bit confusing because on the one hand, you don't want to come across too humble in the sense that, you're downplaying your accomplishments, you're, under promoting your accomplishments and the things you have, your skills, your education, your experience. You don't want to put all kinds of disclaimers on it and sort of beat yourself up over it and say, well, I guess I have this, or you forget to say something big. That's like a real feather in your cap. So you don't want to be too humble, but at the same time, you don't want to come across too arrogant. Now, that sounds self-evident, but it can be deceptive because, on the other hand, you know that you have to brag a little. You have to explain why you're a great candidate if you expect them to choose you for the job, right? And so the problem is some people can go a little overboard and come across arrogant. So it's a very fine line, right? The other thing is that if you appear desperate for a job, that tends to count against you. So some people go a little too far in the opposite direction, and whether it's true or they're just sort of faking it, they give the impression that, I don't need this job. I got many job offers coming my way. I'm in demand. So, I'm going to downplay this. I'm going to be perhaps a little too comfortable in answering the questions because this is not important to me. And that comes across as arrogant, which counts against you. So once again, it's a very fine line. Job interviews are about your soft skills. Hopefully you know this already. I'm brushing the dust off my monitor here, because now that everything's lit up by sunlight, I can actually see it. Job interviews are about soft skills. That's counterintuitive to a lot of people. You would think they're about your technical skills. They should be about your technical skills. And you get down to the interview and they're asking you about your technical skills. So this gives the impression that they're about your technical skills. The reality is that they're not, okay? When you submitted an application for the job, you attached your resume and maybe a cover letter, or filled out an online form or something. That's where they evaluated your technical skills, okay? The only people that they choose to bring down to a job interview are people who, they're pretty confident that you have the technical skills. You could technically do the job if they chose you. Because it doesn't make any sense to bring down candidates to an interview who on paper don't have the skills to do the job. That would be a waste of everybody's time. They don't care about wasting your time. They care about wasting their own time, right? They're not going to invite candidates down to interviews that on paper are just not qualified, right? So the assumption is that you are qualified if you're down at the interview. They've obviously decided that on paper, you look like you're perfectly qualified. And you know this as evidenced by the fact that you've come down, right? So the job interview is really not about your technical skills. It's about your soft skills, who you are as a person. And I know this sounds very wishy-washy and flaky and intangible, but you see, the idea is that there are many people out there who technically could do the job. The question now is, would they want to work with this person or that person? Maybe one person is technically very gifted, but they're absolutely insufferable to work with. Or another person, maybe they're, once again, technically very gifted, but they consider this job kind of beneath them. They applied because they need a job, but really, this is not really what they want to be doing. If they had their own way, they would be working a different job, a much different job than this one, maybe at a higher level, which they would be qualified for. So if you hire them, it might not be the right choice because they won't take this job seriously. They'll be very impatient. They won't really be engaged. They won't really try very hard because they consider it kind of beneath their dignity to do this work, right? So that's the kind of thing that doesn't show up on a resume or an application. That's the kind of thing that you can only tell you can maybe tell by talking to them in person. So this is the kind of thing that they're wanting to check for in a job interview. This is what they're evaluating you on, okay? This kind of thing, your soft skills. Okay, so we talked about this question, why they ask it, what's going on. One further thing I've got to say to set this up, and that is that when you answer this question, when you make your first impression, pay attention to your manners, to etiquette, okay, to protocol, that kind of thing. Be pleasant. If there's one candidate just kind of looks like this, they look bored or they look kind of annoyed, right? That's almost an automatic fail for a lot of job interviewers. But if you look like you're happy to be there, you look pleasant, you look ready to engage, and you seem like you want to be there and you're excited to see where this goes, that's a huge part of how they're going to evaluate you. Okay, so it's not necessarily too much what you say, it's sometimes how you say it. I hate getting into this stuff because it's silly, but it's true. It's absolutely true. You have no idea how important this stuff really is. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of actually answering this. Okay, so you go to a job interview, they sit you down, you do all the pleasantries, you shake hands, the greetings, all that. You sit down at the table, and they say, well, thank you for coming in. So tell me about yourself. The obvious question is, what the hell are they wanting to hear? Because this is so general. You could talk about your vital statistics, your height, your weight. You could talk about your blood type. You could talk about your ambitions in life. You could talk about your hobbies. You could talk about your political opinions. You could talk about just anything under the sun, your family. Are they wanting to hear that stuff? Not really, no. So how do we figure out what they're actually asking here? Well, the answer is the context. Okay, you applied for a specific job. They invited you down to this interview to evaluate you for the specific job. So your answer, presumably, should be related to this specific job in some way, right? That's really what they're asking about. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. They're not wanting to hear things that are unrelated to this job. So they wouldn't want to hear about your family. They wouldn't want to hear about your political opinions. They wouldn't want to hear about your food dislikes, okay, or your hobbies, right? They care about things that are pertinent to this role. And just so everyone knows, a recruiter's job is to go out and procure candidates who meet a list of requirements. That's a recruiter's role. They don't write the requirements. They're given a list of requirements by their client. If they're internal to a company, the client is the hiring manager, the person who's actually wanting a new employee for their department. They're the boss of a group of people. They've decided they need to hire an extra person. They have an idea of what role that person is going to play, right? So they then have an idea of kind of what the requirements would be. So one way or another, they contact a recruiter. The recruiter works in the HR department. And they tell the recruiter, look, I need you to get me some candidates that fit this list of requirements. Okay, get me 6 candidates or 10 candidates, somewhere in there, that meet all of these. Okay, go. That's the recruiter's job. Right? So when you come down to the job interview and you're talking to a recruiter, kind of the only thing the recruiter really cares about is that list of requirements. And they're evaluating you. Do you meet those? That's the primary thing they care about. Beyond that, are there any obvious red flags why you would not work out? So for example, if you're already working 2 jobs, maybe you wouldn't work out in this job because your time commitment would be stretched too much, or you wouldn't have enough energy, or you would have divided loyalties, right? Did you get fired from the last 10 jobs that you've had all in a row? You got fired each time. Well, that's a red flag. If that's the pattern of behavior you have, you always get fired from jobs within a short amount of time. If we hire you, it's likely that you'll get fired from this job in a short amount of time. So that's an obvious red flag too. So those are the 2 things they care about, mainly the list of requirements. And then beyond that, are there any obvious red flags? For example, maybe you're overqualified, or, this job is beneath you. Or maybe you've got personality issues and no one can work with you. You're really off-putting and abrasive and hard to, have a civil conversation with, right? Those would be obvious red flags. So these are the kinds of things they're looking for. Okay? Now, if you're at a job interview and you're talking to a recruiter, that's what they care about. If, however, you're talking to a hiring manager, generally speaking, they care about slightly different things. They care about whether they like you. And that's going to be very important to them. Because if you get selected, you're now working for the hiring manager. The hiring manager is now your boss. You'll probably never see the recruiter again. So the recruiter doesn't care too much if they personally get along with you and they would want to work with you, because they don't have any skin in the game there. If they select you, you end up working for the hiring manager. They don't see you again, usually. So it's a little bit different. The recruiters care about the requirements. The hiring manager cares more about whether they like you. And they'll be willing to overlook the fact that you may not technically meet one or more of the requirements if they like you, or if they feel you could bring something else to the role. That's a hiring manager. The recruiters care about the requirements, and they care about red flags. Okay. So now, with all that in mind, how do we answer this question? Now that I've set this up and taken a long time, like 20 minutes to set this up, how do we actually answer? Okay. The basic answer to this is you want to do a summary of your resume very quickly. Now, why do I say that? It's because, number one, everything really pertinent about you in terms of you being an employee will basically be on your resume. The vast majority of all the things that are pertinent about you will be on your resume. So it's kind of hard to say something that's super relevant about you that's not on your resume unless it's your soft skills or your motivation. Those are the only two things that usually aren't on your resume. And even if you write soft skills on your resume, nobody cares because they want to see a demonstration of your soft skills. That's the whole point of a job interview. Okay, so you don't have to talk about your soft skills because you are in the process of demonstrating them in the interview. Okay? When it comes to your motivations, I suppose you could say that. There's no reason why you can't, but it's not the most relevant thing. If this is the first question they ask and you're doing like a very brief introduction to yourself, you're probably going to be saying stuff that's on your resume. The other reason why you'd want to say things that are on your resume is simply this. You've submitted your resume as part of your job application. And based on your resume, they did not eliminate you. Instead, they brought you in for an interview. So that says that the material on your resume is safe. There's nothing on there that's a red flag that they consider bad. Okay, so that's the other reason why you want to say things off your resume, because that material is safe. Yes, this makes the assumption they've read your resume, but that's a pretty safe assumption for most jobs you would want. Okay, so that's the reason why you want to stick to your resume. Now, the other thing is you don't want to take up 10 minutes answering this question, because let's face it, this is an introduction question. It's not really the central reason why you're at the job interview. The central reason you're at the job interview is to give them reasons why you're the person they should pick and not someone else. Okay, so you want to get to that. And so you don't want to stay on the introduction question for half the interview. Okay, so that's the other reason. So a good way to answer this is to give a summary of your resume in under a minute. Okay, now this can be very easily done. I've got some people in the past asking me like, well, you can't do that. It's like, of course you can. Give a 1-minute summary of your resume. Start with your education. You say, I have this degree. Then I've worked here for 5 years in this role at that company. And then I worked here for 2 years in this role at this other company. Right? That's a summary of your resume. And then you end with, and that's what brings me here today, and why I'm excited to learn about this opportunity. Okay, so that's how you answer in a nutshell. Summarize your resume in a minute or less, and you end with, and that's what brings me here today, and why I'm excited to learn about this opportunity. Now, why do I say that? I say that because you're here at the job interview, not to talk about something you did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, not to talk about what you did in school. You're here to talk about how you're the best candidate for this job. You're here to talk about this job. So let's get to it. Let's not dwell on something I did working for another company years ago. That's irrelevant. Let's talk about what I can do for you in this role and why I would fit this role perfectly. That's what you want to talk about in the interview. Okay, so that's the reason why you want to get off this question relatively quickly and steer the conversation to, let's talk about this role and how I fit and how I'm awesome and I'm the best person for it. Okay, so once again, how do you answer, tell me about yourself in an interview? You give a 1 minute or less summary of your resume. It helps if maybe you start with your education and then move on to your experience, work experience. Start with the stuff in the past and then come up to the present. So education, older experience, and then newer experience, ending with your last position. And then once you've said that in under a minute, just give the broad strokes. You say, and that's what brings me here today and why I'm excited to learn more about this position or this opportunity. So you can get talking about that. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Now, if you don't know how to start talking, you don't know what to say when you first open your mouth, you could say, when they say, tell me about yourself, you say, well, as you can see from my resume, you could say that. You have to say it the right way. Don't say it in an arrogant way, right? It's more of a memory jog for you than it is something that's really for them. Or you could skip that. That line is optional if it sounds kind of clunky and sounds a little, like you're talking down to people. But you could say, well, as you can see from my resume, I have this education. I got that 10 years ago. I then worked in this role at this company for 5 years. And then I moved to this other company. I was in this role for the last 3 years. And that's my current position that I'm still in. And that's what brings me here today and why I'm excited to talk about this position or this opportunity. Okay, that's a good format, template format for people to frame their answer with. Okay, now let's talk about some special cases. What if you have no work experience? Okay, this is a question that a lot of people have asked. That's all well and good to go down your work experience, but what if you have no work experience? Okay, here's what I would say. First of all, the fact that you have no work experience is essentially crap. Okay, even if you've never had an actual job before, what you do have is you do have the constituent skills that you're going to be needing to do this job. Okay, now let me explain. When you were in school, let's say you've taken university or college or trade school or something, okay, and you haven't yet worked in the industry, you haven't had an industry-related job yet, and this is going to be hopefully your first industry-related job, first professional job, okay, if you get it. Up to this point, you can't say, oh, I have no experience. Because you do have experience. What you have is, if you've got, say, a educational qualification like a degree, that shows that you have several things. You have, first of all, you have a good work ethic. Okay? It shows you can meet deadlines. It shows that you're highly trainable. It shows that you have experience, presumably, working in groups and, coordinating with other people. It shows that you have experience solving issues. If you're given an assignment and you don't understand how to do the assignment, you can go and get help. You can ask clarifying questions so that you can then go back and do the assignment. Okay, you can get clarification when you need it. You're punctual and you're capable. If you've done group work, you could break that down and it shows that you've been able to correct and control what's going on. So for example, if you know how to do a division of labor, who's going to do what in this project, and then as there are developments, you can adjust for those developments and still complete the work on time. Maybe you have skills presenting. You've presented your work in front of the class, so you might have public speaking skills, presenting skills, this kind of thing. I could go on and on, but these are all the things that you have. Now, what do they need you to do in this job that you're applying for? Well, they need you to have technical skills, right? Which you have by virtue of your degree. They need you to be trainable. They need you to be punctual. They need you to have a good work ethic. They need you to be able to ask for clarification when you need it. They need you to be able to work in groups and interoperate with other people. They need you to adapt to the situation. So if you're working with others and maybe things are going off the rails a little, you need to be able to make adjustments, and you've shown that you can do that. So, a lot of what, and the ability to follow instructions for a start, right? So you have all this. So if someone, says tell me about your work experience or tell me about yourself, you have a lot of practical experience doing these constituent skills. So you have a lot to talk about when it comes to experience. Don't let the fact that you haven't had a professional job in this industry yet convince you that, oh, I have no experience. When they say, tell me about your experience, you say, I don't have anything. Wrong. You have a lot you could talk about, and a lot of things that speak directly to what they're going to be wanting in someone to do this role. Okay. There's so much under this. Like, you understand what's appropriate professional conduct. You understand what's appropriate work attire, right? Things like this, like things you can speak to by virtue of what you have done, say in school, right? You've demonstrated this stuff. If you've ever presented anything, that shows you that you have a certain level of professionalism, and so on and so forth, right? So if you take a few minutes to think about this stuff, you could write a very long list of all the things you do have that you can talk about. So even if you haven't had a job, you got a lot to say. Sheena is here. Sheena says, nice content. Well, thank you very much, Sheena. That's very nice of you to say. And if anyone has any specific questions, don't be shy. Don't be intimidated by talking to somebody who is well over 200 pounds, like I am. No need to be afraid, right? Just ask your question in the chat box, and I will read it, and I will see if I can get you a good answer on it. Okay. Now, as I said, the purpose of a job interview is to talk about the job that they're interviewing for. So don't get sidetracked in this question. When they say, tell me about yourself, you start talking about something you did years ago in another company. It has nothing to do with this role. You start getting into details that just don't matter, right? It's not relevant to why you're here. So that's why we want to try and get off this question relatively quickly. Okay? And if we can, steer the conversation towards them talking about this job. Okay, there's one last thing I want to say about this question that I think is relevant. And that is that there is a variant of this question that you sometimes hear where they will ask you, tell me something about yourself not on your resume. Right? That's something that is occasionally asked. In fact, I have a video coming out tomorrow that talks about that question. Now, here's the thing. A lot of recruiters think that by phrasing the introduction question like that, they can avoid you from giving information that's on your resume. Okay? Now, I'm here to tell you that in the vast majority of cases, when you go to a job interview and you're sitting and talking to a recruiter and they ask you that question, tell me something about yourself not on your resume, in the vast majority of cases, they haven't read your resume with any great care. They might know one or two things maybe on there, but beyond that, they don't know what's on there. They haven't read it recently, and they haven't read it in depth. Or if they have read it in depth, it was a while ago when you submitted your application. And this is maybe weeks later, and they don't remember what was on there. They barely remember who you are at this point. Okay? So there's a way to literally answer that question. You're going to give them something that's not on your resume, okay? But I'm here to tell you that that question is simply another form of this question. And if you give the same answer that we've just been talking about, they won't know or care that stuff is actually on your resume.